Hello and welcome of course to another car review in the world of Gran Turismo 7, and you can't really make Gran Turismo 7 content right now at the time of this video's release without addressing the current situation. For those who didn't watch it already, I made a basically rant and overview review of the game a couple of days ago to give my full thoughts on the changes in money that you win and just the game as a whole. So if you have questions about my stance on that, I would strongly recommend you check out that video, because chances are I probably touched on many of the questions you would have. For now though, I am still producing content. I know some people disagree with that, some people wish I wasn't, some people just think it's pointless. Well, at the end of the day, I would have to remind those people that regardless of whether the game is good or not, I never loved GT Sport either. But I still had to put out content for it because this is my livelihood, or at least part of it, and there are still a significant amount of people in the community who are still trying to get enjoyment out of the game. So for those reasons and more, I do still want to put out content. However, this, thankfully, is one of those occasions where we can talk about a car and actually not get as bogged down about the gameplay in general, because, spoiler alert for those who don't have it yet, you don't even have to buy it, which is great because it's technically not even in the Peugeot dealer. Now, I'm not sure if this car will eventually show up in like a legendary dealer or a used dealer, because the cars that they have in there, especially the used one, are pretty weird sometimes, like a used Lamborghini LP640. Seems like kind of an odd choice to have in there, and a couple of others too, so I could see that happening, but as yet, I haven't seen this car pop up. It doesn't really matter though, because in the higher tier cafe missions, which of course don't take that long to complete anyway, you can win this car for free as part of the 3-car collection, along with I think an Audi Quattro was one of them, and I don't recall the other car at the moment. Now the Quattro of course is a fan favourite, but to me I was far more excited to see this car come back. We didn't have it in Sport, we did have it of course in the games before that, and I believe if memory serves Gran Turismo 4 might have been the first time we saw this car. There were 2 different versions, a lesser powered with no wing and smaller winglets, and this full red-blooded monster with about 450 horses. Now, even though it wasn't the most powerful thing in the game, and again, if memory serves, even with full tuning, it was only in the high 500-ish horsepower region, I believe, it was still a great little car. Of course, the Suzuki Escudo overpowered everything at the time, so that was all anyone talked about, but I used to love using the cars that were less obvious. Some of my favourites, for example, were this one, the Hyundai Accent WRC car, and even the Mitsubishi Starion. Now this one, returning to the game, presents an interesting question, because when bringing back a familiar face which has skipped a game, like the Chaparral 2J, there are a number of options for how Polyphony could handle that. They could make it worse, they could nerf it, in other words, they could make it basically just an HD recreation, or they could make it better than it was. So how's it fallen this time? Because as I talked about in my review for the Chaparral, it's not quite as OP as it used to be, but still very good. Well, interestingly, in the case of this one, it's actually better than it used to be. The one that I'm driving here actually has like a stage 3 or whatever the equivalent turbo would be, the high RPM turbo in particular, giving over 700 horsepower now. It's like 716. Basing that on the 445 that it has to begin with, which is already more than good enough to be a force to be reckoned with in the 80s. Not so much now though against the fictional custom-built Group B cars that Gran Turismo created, like the NSX and the GTR, etc. So the question is, how does it fare against those? Well, the biggest standout thing for me about this car, because, spoiler alert, I believe it's still very good, especially for its age, is the low-end lag. Now, some of that's probably due to my choice of a high RPM turbo, given that for most rally cars that's kind of pointless, because there are very few times that you need like 150 mile an hour potential, so going for a smaller turbo could definitely have better results, low RPM, medium RPM. I just go big or go home when it comes to my specs though, so I'm fine with that. It does mean that you need to adjust your driving style a little bit, because I love the fact that it does have that little bit of lag, that kind of traditional, everybody knows about lag that came from the 80s and 90s turbo era, and it started to get away of course as efficiency improved. Now in the case of this car, that lag essentially just means that you need to adjust your throttle control a tiny bit, just floor it or roll onto the throttle depending on your driving style just a fraction of a second earlier than you usually would, because instead of the car spinning out or going wide, it just allows you to have that little bit of spool up time to reduce the lag and keep your flow going. One of the things which I still love about the car that I used to love is its proportions. Much like the Chaparral, ironically enough again, this car feels kind of like driving a little cube. The proportions are really good. It's not that long, it's not that wide, and it's not that tall. It's almost like a crazy overpowered K car from Japan, and I love the way the 205 feels. Now, in terms of the performance points, for those who are curious, stock, it's 678, which is fairly high, not too surprisingly, and tuned up, my example here at least, is 694. And you can make that even higher if you adjust downforce, etc. So around the 700-ish performance point region is quite high. It's not crazy, but it's certainly quite high. The weight though is very low. 910 kilos is great. It means it even undercuts some of the other Group B cars. Again, if memory serves, including the Audi Quattro, which I believe was more like a ton, like 1,000 kilos or maybe even more. Ultimately, I think this is a great example of a historic car which was so good and so fast in its time that it can still compete now. And that is just a testament to how good it is. I love using old school rally cars against newer stuff in Gran Turismo because to me, it's not so much to do with the newer ones being fictional or not, it's just that many of these older cars have more charm and they have more character. And finally seeing this thing with that fully modelled HD interior, that little wooden gear shifter, it's just a lovely little car to drive. And the fact that you don't even have to buy it really is the cherry on top. And technically, it's a hell of a lot easier to get this car if you're a fan of it than it is to get something like a Chaparral 2J, which even if you are a great driver, will still take you quite some time to work through all of those missions. So ultimately, those are my thoughts on the 205. I'm really glad that it's back actually, despite my overall thoughts on the game at the moment. So if you haven't got it yet, work your way through the cafe. I would say it's definitely worth it. And for those who do own the car, tell me your thoughts. Do you agree or disagree with certain points? What's your overall feel on the 205? And of course, if you're new to the channel and want to check out my other reviews, click the playlist here on the screen, and obviously stick around on the channel for more in future. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.